What if the first president of the United States was also the first American to ascend to heaven?
On this episode of Arcanum, the Ascension of George Washington.
Ascension refers to climbing or rising upward.
Spiritually, it refers to taking our body into heaven while we are still alive.
Can ordinary people rise or ascend to the divine? Numerous spiritual traditions tell us we can.
Doing so requires a transformation of our bodies into a subtler form. This is the secret of Arcanum.
Jewish mystics known as the Essenes tell the story of Enoch, who was an ordinary man who was translated to heaven while still alive. He had help from the archangel Michael, who anointed him with an oil that dissolved his body into rainbow-colored light.
Enoch's extraordinary story was lost until James Bruce discovered the Book of Enoch in 1773.
Strangely, just 3 years later, George Washington became America's first president.
Washington was revered as an ordinary man who was able to accomplish the extraordinary when he led the first Americans to freedom and the founding of a new nation dedicated the freedom and liberty of the individual.
Some even believe Washington was divinely guided in this endeavor. What many don't realize is that Masons eulogize George Washington as Enoch. Depictions of Washington after his death often portrayed him ascending into heaven like Enoch. What exactly are they trying to say here?
Perhaps the most astounding depictions of the ascended Washington is in the dome of the US Capitol. This is one of the most profound ascension images to be found anywhere. And in his feature investigation, William will take you inside the Arcanum in the US Capitol.
I'd like to begin my presentation today with some quotes about the U.S. Capitol as a temple of ascension or apotheosis. We begin with this quote that's inscribed in the House wing of the Capitol in the 1830s. It's by Rufus Choate, who was a congressman from Massachusetts, who said, "We have built no temple but the Capitol. We consult no common oracle but the Constitution." These are religious terms that are being used to describe a civic building, the U.S. Capitol, as a temple, and the Constitution as a divinely received oracle or manuscript. An 18th century poet named Benjamin Russell envisioned the Capitol's dome in his tome, The Birth of Columbia, which was published on December 3rd, 1788. He writes, "Behold, the federal dome, majestic rise, on lofty pillars reared, whose ample base on firm foundations laid unmoved shall stand, till happy your unnumbered circles run, the temple of celestial liberty, who designs from heaven to bless our happy plains." This expresses the belief that the U.S. Capitol was conceived as a temple of celestial liberty, a star temple that was there as a shining beacon whose design was brought from heaven to earth to stand as a beacon of light for hope and liberty. Congressman James Wilson of Pennsylvania prophesied in 1787 that America's new federal government would, quote, "lay a foundation for erecting temples of liberty in every part of the earth," unquote. Again, telling us that the founding fathers and the founders of America believed that the U.S. Capitol was in fact a temple that was divinely ordained to spread freedom throughout the world. Thomas Jefferson, the Capitol's chief visionary, called it the first temple dedicated to the sovereignty of the people. This had never happened in human history before, where a nation was founded that was dedicated to liberty, freedom, and the sovereignty, the ascension of the individual. An anonymous essay of 1795 described the Capitol building as a temple erected to liberty. So you get the idea over and over again. This profound concept is pulled out of the imagination of Jefferson and rendered in stone in the nation's capital. It would be unbecoming, says John Adams, the representatives of this nation to assemble for the first time in this solemn temple without looking up to the supreme ruler of the universe and imploring his blessing. This is President Adams speaking on November 22nd, 1800, opening the second session of the Sixth Congress in the new Capitol building. So over and over again, these men are telling us that the Capitol is a temple and America is a divinely ordained nation. These words are more than poetic. The U.S. Capitol, in fact, has numerous architectural features and other features that unquestionably identify it with ancient temples. So the stone construction and underground entrance, chapels, an image of a deified being, George Washington, as we'll see in a moment, religious imagery, symbols and inscriptions, divine proportions, sacred geometry, massive columns, palpable spiritual energy, acoustic trickery, terrifying guardians who today carry automatic weapons, mystic visitors, closed doors, private members, secret chambers, and especially an orientation to the sun tell us that the U.S. Capitol is in fact a temple. Specifically, the founders of the Capitol Temple likened it to Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. And this is a key to understanding the symbolism of the U.S. Capitol Temple. Here we see Solomon's temple with a domed roof and obelisks from a Masonic songbook from a Grand Lodge in England. Now, here's the thing. Judeo-Christian end-time prophecy envisions the construction of the third Temple of Solomon, the first two having been destroyed in ancient times. And they believed that this new temple would be associated with the coming of the Jewish Messiah or the Messianic era. And in Christianity, this, of course, is the second coming of Christ. This rendition of Solomon's temple is envisioned with a dome. The Bible says nothing about a dome on Solomon's temple, but yet the Masons were clear in their artistic renderings of Solomon's temple that in fact it was domed. In this rendering from England, we see the pillars out front with the domed Temple of Solomon looking rather like a beehive, in fact. Where did they get this idea? Well, it might have come from the Vatican. What we're looking at here is Perigonu's painting of Christ giving the keys to St. Peter. This is one of the more powerful paintings in the Vatican. When when the cardinals gather to elect the new pope, the individual in the chapel that sleeps beneath this painting is considered to be the most favored individual. And what we see here is Christ giving the keys to Peter, and in the background we see Solomon's temple. And in fact, it is domed. What Perigono shows us here is not only a domed Temple of Solomon, but also that dome sitting on an octagonal platform. So here's Christ giving the keys to Peter, and then in the background, the domed Temple of Solomon on an octagonal platform. I want you to remember this because when we later explore the diagrams of the U.S. Capitol, we're going to see that it too, the dome also sits on an octagonal platform. And here's the detail. Now here's the U.S. Capitol in 1830. We see the east entrance here with the dome as it then existed on top. Now let's compare that with Perigonu's painting in the Vatican. You can see they're virtually identical structures. And one wonders if in fact the founding fathers actually got the design off of Perigonu's painting in the Vatican. Raphael also painted a domed Temple of Solomon. Here is the marriage of the Virgin. We see Mary with Joseph, and in the background we see the domed Solomon's temple, this time with a polygonal base. And here is that polygonal base with the domed roof. So did Solomon's temple in fact have a dome? And is this in part the inspiration for putting a dome on the U.S. Capitol? Did the Masons who conceived of Solomon's temple as their lodge also conceive of the U.S. Capitol as a new Temple of Solomon, in fact the third Temple of Solomon? It's important for us here to recognize the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which occupies the site of Solomon's temple. The dome conceals what is considered to be the most sacred rock and dot of real estate on earth. It's called the foundation stone and is said to have been planted here at the beginning of creation and taken by God from his throne of glory. Jews, of course, see this as the center of the earth and the axis of the universe, the ladder or stairway to heaven, the pivot that joins heaven and earth. And underneath the dome is where we see the foundation stone. This is the location, of course, of where the Ark of the Covenant was taken by Moses. Jerusalem's Dome of the Rock was built between 687 and 691 AD and is considered hallowed ground. Jews venerate it as the site where Solomon's temple once stood. It's an octagonal platform with a dome on top, and this place is considered an X-place or a portal leading into the heavenly realms. In fact, it was from this location, which is now marked by this gateway symbolism, that Muhammad ascended into the heavens on his magic horse, Al-Buraq, locating this as a sacred site for not just Jews and Christians, but also for Muslims as well. Now, coming back to the Capitol, we're going to look at how that dome was actually placed on top of the Capitol. It happened when Abraham Lincoln took office in March 1861. At that time, America was on the verge of a bloody civil war that would have devastating consequences for the first term of Lincoln's administration. It was Lincoln who was destined to put the Solomonic Dome on the Capitol. In fact, on the Capitol lawn at Lincoln's inaugural, visitors could see the model of the Statue of Freedom, the goddess Freedom, that was destined for the top of the Capitol. Here we're looking at Thomas Eustick Walter's watercolor, his visualization of the dome. When Congress saw this watercolor, they instantly funded construction of what was called the new High Dome. And as the construction unfolded, a question began to emerge in the minds of visitors and everyone in Washington, and that was, what would be painted on the interior or the oculus of that dome? And here we see Walter's rendering of a possible vision of what he would see in there. We see Freedom, who is also destined to top that dome, Freedom being the goddess of America. And what happened is that as the Civil War began, and people began to die and blood was being spilled, some urged Lincoln to devote the Capitol building funds to the war effort. Lincoln, however, insisted on continuing the construction of the new High Dome as a symbol of the hope for the future of the Union. And so here we see this painting from inside the congressional side of the Capitol of Lincoln posing almost like a magician. You can imagine him willing to raise that high dome and with it to raise America's future and to take us forward. Here is the plan of the dome from 1863, also by Philadelphia architect Thomas Eustick Walter. And here's where we get this correspondence with Solomon's temple. Because look what we see here is we have this octagonal platform upon which the dome would sit. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to compare a line drawing of the octagonal plan of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, where we see the octagonal plan with the sacred rock, the foundation stone, in the center. Now, let's compare the line drawing of the Dome of the Rock with this drawing by Walter of the new High Dome. And what we see is that they're virtually identical, if not interchangeable drawings. In fact, what we can do is we can take the plan of the Dome of the Rock and superimpose it over the plan of the new High Dome, and we have a new perfect match. So here what we're looking at is a Masonic interpretation of the U.S. Capitol, not just as a Masonic lodge, but also as a rebuilding of Solomon's temple. Is the U.S. Capitol, in fact, the rebuilt Solomon's temple, the third temple of Solomon? It's a very controversial question, but one that is and certainly enjoyed by Masons. So here we're looking at photographs of the rising of the new High Dome. And we see it rising in majesty here as they're preparing now to put the cupola on the dome. It continues to rise until in 1864, 1865, Finally, it's completed, and we have the Statue of Freedom placed on top. Inside the dome, of course, is the Capitol Rotunda, which is a large circular room that's located in the center of the Capitol on the second floor. It's 96 feet in diameter, so it's quite a large room. It's the symbolic and physical heart of the U.S. Capitol. It's also the ceremonial center of the United States of America. In this extraordinary room, magnificent room, is where powerful American ceremonies take place. It's a place of ritual. And here we're looking into the entranceway used by congressmen and senators. The beam of light is actually headed towards or beaming towards the center of the rotunda. And in the center of the rotunda is this gold dot. And this is going to become very important later in our exploration, so make a note of that. And this is in fact me standing on that gold dot in the center of the rotunda, looking up into the oculus or eye of the dome. Here I am looking now from the top-down view. We're high in the dome now, and we're looking down into the rotunda where we see the gold dot in the center and the various paintings and statuary that inhabit the rotunda. The gold dot in the center. Now we're even higher up into the dome, and it's starting to appear in our imagination almost like this place is a gateway of sorts. And that's what we're going to see this place actually is. And now we're finally high up in the dome looking down into the rotunda. More directly, the rotunda, as I noted, is a place of American ritual. Rites are performed here. Statues such as the one of Washington and Jefferson and present-day Ronald Reagan are unveiled here. Inaugurations used to take place here. Eminent citizens lay in state in this rotunda. In fact, it was the assassinated body of honest Abraham Lincoln, the first president to be assassinated, which has forever hallowed this spot. And it's quite a poignant recognition to realize that it was Lincoln who willed this high dome to be constructed, not knowing that his assassinated body would soon lay in state in this place, making it sacred ground for all Americans. And here is a diagram, or a painting rather, of Abraham Lincoln laying in state in the rotunda. What would happen is visitors would file along Pennsylvania Avenue and then come into the Capitol and then make a circle around the president as he lay in state in the rotunda. Crossing cultures, let's talk about the dome here and its significance. The dome is a cosmic symbol. It's equivalent to the stupa of India and China. A stupa is a Sanskrit word that means heap. It's a mound-like structure containing Buddhist relics, and its hemispheric shape represents the world egg and the womb. Domes, of course, are feminine, and they're considered to be gateways into other worlds or perhaps other dimensions. And what happens is that in Buddhism, the relics are placed inside the stupa, and they symbolize the seed of life or the seed of rebirth. It's a very key idea here as we begin to interpret the U.S. Capitol dome as a temple. Later, the stupa became a symbol of the Buddha's final release from the cycle of birth and rebirth. Now, let's think about this in terms of what happens when we lay our deceased presidents in state in the center of the rotunda, in the center of this stupa. The stupa and dome actually create a spiral or a vortex of energy that spins around a central axis. So whether we're in a Buddhist temple or in the U.S. Capitol temple, we're actually in a vortex created by the design of the dome. This is the intention of the dome, is to create this spiraling vortex or axis of energy that assists actually in the rebirth of those who are placed in the rotunda. Actually, we can get a real clear sense of this vortex idea when they rebuilt the Reichstag dome in Berlin after World War II. They placed this dome over the Reichstag building, and what we see here is this architectural feature actually includes or features, highlights a spiraling vortex inside. We have to imagine that this is exactly what is happening inside the dome of the U.S. Capitol when we're standing on that gold dot. Maybe this is why they don't let you stand on that gold dot in the dome of the U.S. Capitol. But as we'll see later, I've actually done that and experienced this vortex of energy inside the dome of the U.S. Capitol. So very interesting insight here. Now what we're actually looking at here is Gerald Ford, President Gerald Ford's body, laying in state in the rotunda of the Capitol. Look at that view of this vortex. You can't tell me by looking at that you're not getting an idea that this place is in fact designed as a portal or a gateway. And now, just imagine the effect. Now we're looking down here at President Ronald Reagan's body laying in state. We see people entering into the rotunda. And what do they do when they come into the rotunda? Well, the answer is that they actually circumnavigate or navigate the body laying in state. They're in a vortex. The body is laying in the center on the gold dot, in the center of this axis of energy. And what do people do as they walk by? They direct prayer energy at the body of the deceased president. Now, what kind of effect would you suppose that might have on the spirit or soul of the president? You have to imagine that they are actually infusing their spirit or soul with this powerful prayer energy in this vortex. And you can almost imagine that if the soul is still close to the body, that then it is then actually ascending through this cosmic spiral or gateway. Here's a key thing about the Capitol and the dome and the stupa, is that the dome symbolizes the cranium. Dome, of course, is slang for the head. So in fact, the dome of the U.S. Capitol is actually symbolic of our own dome, our own consciousness. And the object of all arcanum is to trigger the latent capabilities within our consciousness and transform us into free or sovereign beings. So lo and behold, the dome of the U.S. Capitol actually encodes this entire process in stone for those with eyes to see. And the key thing here is that, again, the U.S. Capitol is a temple that was conceived as the temple of celestial liberty, the temple where free and sovereign beings could learn the process of ascension and even resurrection. So this is me inside the Capitol Visitor Center, standing in the dome, pointing at the painting in the oculus now of the dome, the apotheosis of George Washington, and recognizing that what we have here is one of the most incredible temple structures conceived anywhere at any time on earth. So now, let's take a look at the painting in the oculus or eye of the dome, the apotheosis of George Washington. The painter is Constantino Brumidi, who came from Italy in the early 1840s. And Claire is going to talk with us momentarily in detail about Constantino Brumidi and how he came to conceive this painting and what it meant to him and possibly his intention behind creating the apotheosis of Washington. What we're actually looking at here is one of Brumidi's studies for the apotheosis of Washington. That word apotheosis is very important and very, very insightful. It means to deify, to raise from a man to a God-man, or to transform an ordinary human into a divine being. And so Brumidi's given basically free rein to paint anything he wants in the oculus or eye of the dome after it's completed in 1865. What does he paint? He shows us Washington surrounded by divine or celestial beings. He's ascended into the heavens. And what Brumidi does is he includes the arcing rainbow to indicate that Washington has achieved the ascended state. Brumidi actually prepared this study of the apotheosis for Thomas Eustace Walter, the architect of the Capitol, who liked it enough that he took it to his Germantown home in his residence in Philadelphia. So as we continue here, we actually are going to recognize that Washington is under the rainbow and surrounded by celestial or star beings. Brumidi actually did a second study for the apotheosis. The second study had been lost for a long time until it was finally recovered in 2012 and is now in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. So this is the second study for the apotheosis of Washington. This time, Washington is not under the rainbow, he's on it. Now this is extraordinary because Brumidi is delivering a very clear message here that Washington is not just a man, he is now a deified being. In fact, in his description, in Brumidi's own description of this painting, he describes Washington not as the father of the United States, but rather the savior of America. Major distinction. Clearly putting a layer of religiosity onto Washington. He also puts, intriguingly, 72 stars around the apotheosis, creating a gate, a stargate, in which this painting would be viewed. 72 is one of the most important numbers in all of esoteric numerology, symbolizing not only the number of degrees in astrology, but also the number of the names of God, and also the number of the jinn, or the demon spirits that Solomon was said to have controlled with his ring, fashioned from the Chintamani stone, by the way. So what we see here is Washington on the rainbow, still surrounded by the celestial or the star beings. We know they're celestial beings because they've got stars on their heads. And also, this is a heavenly scene. It's not an earthly scene. Actually, when you take a tour of the Capitol, the Capitol guides will try to tell you that these 13 maidens that surround Washington symbolize the 13 original colonies. Well, but that can't be, because we're not on earth, guys. We're in the celestial realm. We're in the heavenly realm. So what do these 13 maidens symbolize? We'll answer that question momentarily. Just for now, we're familiarizing ourselves with the iconography of the apotheosis of Washington and recognizing that Constantino Brumidi is showing Washington as a divine being, the savior of the country. In his final rendering, which is what we see today in the oculus of the dome, we see this magnificent painting, full-blown, come to life. So what we're doing now is we're in the rotunda, we're looking up into the dome, and we see the 72 stars forming the star gate surrounding the apotheosis of Washington. Brumidi has made a couple of modifications to his fresco here that become very important to us as we decode this painting. And as we continue, we're going to pull back the layers and reveal the incredible message that Brumidi has encoded within this painting. So for now, let's just zero in on this and take a moment to more greatly familiarize ourselves with what we're seeing here. So here as we're spinning around the painting, looking at it from different views, what we're going to see ultimately is Washington enthroned on the rainbow with fame and liberty on either side of him. And here again are the 13 maidens, now again with the stars on their heads. These are celestial or star beings that surround him. But why only 13? We'll come back again to that in just a moment. And as we tour around the painting and in the detail, we see Washington with his purple robe on. We see Fame blowing a trumpet, indicating a sound or vibration is present. And we see Liberty holding the fasces, wearing her Liberty cap. These are the goddesses of America. And most people today don't realize the number of goddesses that are present in early American iconography. Not only is there liberty and fame and freedom, but there's also a goddess named America who's on the east entrance to the Capitol. And you know what? She's wearing a cloak of stars and a star crown. She's another one of the celestial beings that is believed to be divinely guiding America. What we notice behind Washington is the open sun gate or star tunnel behind him as well. Here in the detail, we see the 13 maidens, the 13 star maidens, and we notice that they're holding a banner in their hand. It reads, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Washington is directly connected with the rainbow in early American art. And I want to talk about this for a moment because it's something that's typically not observed by historians and mostly unknown to Americans. This is a painting by Gilbert Stuart. Dolly Madison rescued this famous painting when the British burned the White House in 1812. What we notice is Washington is standing beside a table. The table actually has a leg that is a caduceus, the symbol of Arcanum. But behind him, strangely, is this arcing rainbow. Why the rainbow behind Washington? It's unexplained by Gilbert Stuart, and as I noted, often unobserved. Why, once again, is Washington connected with the symbolism of the rainbow? What are these artists and painters trying to convey with this symbolism? Let's look at this example here. This is Washington as a Freemason from 1866. Take a look at this here, where we have Washington in full Masonic regalia, standing on a Masonic matrix. There's a ladder, which is actually Jacob's ladder, extending from his shoulder. On the ladder are written the letters F, H, and C, which symbolize faith, hope, and charity. But that's by far not the most interesting aspect of this painting. As we follow the ladder emerging from Washington's shoulder, we see faith, hope, and charity, and then we see this strange rainbow burst coming out of the sky. Now, some would take a look at that and say, well, that's got to be a UFO that's present there. That's actually not a UFO. What we're seeing here is a rainbow rip in the fabric of space-time. But even more and beyond that, I'm going to propose to you that what this represents is Washington's ascension into what we're going to describe here as a rainbow body being. What we're going to see as we continue is that Washington was eulogized as Enoch, the translated man whose body was dissolved into rainbow-colored light and then taken into heaven by the Archangel Michael. I believe that that's exactly what this rainbow burst symbolizes, is Washington's transformation from a man into a divine being, just as happened with Enoch. And while it may seem arcane, the apotheosis of Washington was a popular theme among artists after Washington's death and until the Civil War. What this means is that for a period of about 60 years, it was widely believed that George Washington ascended into the heavens just like Enoch, just like Jesus. Now, that's an extraordinary statement to make, but it's actually made by these artists and reflects a commonly held belief after the founding of America and after the death of Washington, all the way up to the time of the Civil War. It's something that we've completely lost, and if I may express a personal view here, I believe we need to get back to these roots, to recognize that the Founding Fathers imagined America as not just a physical space, but also a psychological space where individuals would be free to attain the ultimate human manifestation, our transformation or ascension into light beings. And this explains why Washington was directly connected, not just with Enoch, but as we'll see, directly connected and equated with Christ as an ascended being. What we're looking at here is an engraving by J.J. Bareillet around 1800. It's based on a sermon delivered by Simon Chaudron after Washington's death, equating Washington to Enoch. Now, we explored this in an early Arcanum episode that Enoch is considered to be the same as Thoth or Hermes, the god of Arcanum. Are they trying to say that Washington is a reincarnation of Enoch, or that he was simply like Enoch in his ascension? This is a bold statement that this artist is making, again, based on this sermon. Washington is shown here raised like Enoch and Jesus from the tomb upon a shaft of light by spiritual and temporal beings, in this case, genius and also immortality. So here we see Washington being lifted up by these divine celestial beings, being raised into heaven, into the heavens, on a shaft or beam of light. The Bible tells us that flesh and blood cannot inhabit or inherit the kingdom of heaven. What this means is that Washington must have been transformed in this belief system. He is no longer a flesh and blood man. Instead, he has now somehow been translated is the term they use in the book of Enoch, or transformed into a light being. Wow, what an incredible story. Here's the Apotheosis of Washington. It's by David Edwin. It's after the famous Philadelphia artist Rembrandt Peale. We see Washington being once again lifted into the heavens, ascending into the heavens on a beam or shaft of light, being assisted by celestial beings. An angel places a wreath of immortality on Washington's head. Why do you do this unless you believe this is what happened to Washington? Otherwise, it's totally sacrilegious to equate Washington with Christ. Are you kidding me? They must have had a deep sense that Washington had this profound spiritual transformation or translation into a celestial being. This image here, the Apotheosis of George Washington, is from around 1860. It's by H. Weishaupt and Samuel Moore. It's presently in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. It's where we see Washington once again being lifted into the heavens by celestial beings, divine beings with stars on their heads, indicating they are star beings. Now, there's no other way to interpret this except that we're talking about the belief here that Washington was translated into heaven by celestial beings. It goes to this idea that, in fact, Washington was more than just an ordinary man. We are talking about an extraordinary soul here who created or led in the formation and foundation of a nation dedicated to the enlightenment of the individual. And this, again, I propose is what the Founding Fathers intended for all Americans to experience, to come to this place where they would have the psychological freedom for the first time in human history. There's no pope, there's no priest, there's no politician or pimp all over their back telling them what they can and cannot do. Instead, if they choose, Americans can follow the path of Washington and achieve this translation or transformation into a celestial being. This image here is The Last Judgment. It's from 1850. It's by Rembrandt Lockwood in the Newark Museum in New Jersey. What do we see? We see George Washington once again being lifted into the heavens by a celestial being. So, did in fact an angel or a star being manifest before or shortly after the death of Washington and lift George Washington into the heavens, placing him beside Christ on the heavenly throne? It's an extraordinary concept to wrap our heads around, but the artwork is clear that this was the reigning belief from the time of Washington's death up until the Civil War. And in fact, we find other examples of Washington's ascension in the U.S. Capitol. This is the Car of History. It's by Carlo Franzoni. It's in Statuary Hall of the U.S. Capitol. We see Cleo riding upon her winged chariot. In Jewish mysticism, this is referred to as the Merkaba vehicle. It is the winged chariot or the car of the gods that represents a sort of immortality vehicle through which we're able to travel the cosmos. We see the clock here, as the guides will often point out. We see Cleo up here with the book. But what they often overlook is the fact that we see George Washington's face on the front of this car of history. Now, in my mind, the only way to read this is that this is George Washington's Merkaba vehicle. It goes to this mystic idea, once again, that Washington is an immortal being now, traveling the stars as a divine or celestial being. And here we note once again the presence of the angel, the presence of the sound or vibration that is perhaps empowering Washington's star vehicle, his Merkaba. All the way up until 1865, we had this belief, and we finally get to this postcard that was a popular item actually at the funeral of Abraham Lincoln. It's a fine carte visite of the apotheosis of Lincoln. Now we have the belief that Lincoln also ascended into the heavens, where he was greeted not by Christ, but rather by George Washington. Now, this is absolutely extraordinary to think that Lincoln was also drawn into heaven into the heavens by a celestial being, this time George Washington. Extraordinary. This is a detail from a larger image, an engraving that has angels in the sky to the left, and it's from my private collection. So what we're left with here is this belief and this artistic expression that George Washington, like Enoch, like Thoth, like Osiris, like Christ, ascended into the heavens where he dwells as an immortal and celestial being. Now that's an extraordinary thought. I have a special surprise for you now. In the conclusion of this part of Arcanum, I'm going to offer you a guided tour of the U.S. Capitol. It's one that I did several years ago when you were allowed actually to enter the Temple of Celestial Liberty and wander around basically at will. Ever since 9/11, there's been a bit of a clampdown on the average individual's ability to wander the People's Temple, as the Capitol is also called. So what I'm going to show you is something that probably will not be able to be duplicated any time in the near future, what with the security precautions now in place in the Capitol. So for the next few minutes, let's enjoy together my personal tour of the People's Temple, the Temple of Celestial Liberty. We're standing on the east side of the United States Capitol. Most people don't know that the United States Capitol is a temple. That's right, it was conceived by Thomas Jefferson as a temple of sovereignty. There were poems written in 1793 describing it as the Temple of Celestial Liberty. The Temple of Celestial Liberty, is this a stargate? Is this a star temple? It absolutely is. And when we go inside, we're going to see the example of a deified being floating in the dome of the rotunda. That deity is George Washington, who is portrayed on a rainbow in a heavenly scene. So let's go inside and find the real lost secrets in this temple. We're in one of the most special places in the Capitol that few visitors actually get to visit anymore. This is the tomb of George Washington. This was the place where George Washington and his wife Martha were originally going to be buried. But as you can see, Washington's tomb is empty. Historically, we know that he's buried at Mount Vernon. There was a trust issue with his estate. However, when we look at the Capitol from the perspective that it's a portal or a gateway, Washington's tomb plays a very interesting role. Washington's tomb is empty because actually George Washington is on the ceiling of the rotunda. He is portrayed as a heavenly being. He's portrayed as having ascended, risen from the tomb, just like in the story of Jesus. Now, when we're in the tomb here, what we're looking at is the catafalque upon which the sarcophagus of all of the dead presidents has been laid. The United States Capitol has been considered hallowed ground ever since Abraham Lincoln's assassinated body laid in state in the rotunda on the catafalque that is now on display in the Capitol Visitor Center. The interesting thing about this is that when we look up at the apotheosis of George Washington and draw a direct vertical line from the sun, the open sun gate behind Washington, and we go down straight through the gold dot in the center of the rotunda, straight through the white star in the center of the crypt, one story beneath it, directly beneath it, is this tomb of Washington, leading some of us, including myself as a researcher, to wonder, is this some sort of a mystery initiation that could be enacted in this room? Is this sort of like the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid, which is also empty? In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh would lay in the sarcophagus in the king's chamber and would visualize himself traveling out of the pyramid into the stars, into the heavenly realms. And you can just imagine Masonic rituals being performed in this Masonic lodge, because that's what the Capitol is. It is literally a lodge. You can visualize them in this room, attuning themselves with the heavenly realms and visualizing themselves traveling through the white star one story above, through the gold dot one story above that, and then up through the sun gate in the apotheosis of George Washington. We're in the crypt of the United States Capitol. What's fascinating about this is that this is a civic building. Civic buildings don't have crypts. Temples have crypts. Churches have crypts. Cathedrals have crypts. But this building has a crypt. Why? Because the United States Capitol is actually a temple. Thomas Jefferson called it the Temple of Sovereignty. When it was built, there were poems written calling it the Temple of Celestial Liberty. So this makes the crypt a very important room. It's one story above Washington's tomb, and one below, the rotunda. When we look at the crypt, we're seeing 40 magnificent stone pillars that are modeled after the Temple of Poseidon in ancient Athens. The reason why the Temple of Poseidon is so important is because the founding fathers were members of the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons, secret societies that believed that America was the new Atlantis. Poseidon was the priest king of the original Atlantis. So by building the crypt in the model of the Temple of Poseidon, they're paying homage to the original priest king or founder of Atlantis. When we go into this Temple of Poseidon, at the very center of Washington is this amazing white star. It's called the Seed of Washington. All the mile markers for Washington, D.C. are measured relative to this Seed of Washington. It's a very powerful symbol, and when we stand on it, we are experiencing this amazing acoustic effect. My voice is literally reverberating off the columns, and I hear an echo inside my head. If I were to go right straight through this chandelier, through the ceiling, I would be in the rotunda of the Capitol, one story above me. Just above that is the open sun gate in the apotheosis of George Washington. So standing on the crypt here is a very powerful spot. Now we're in the most special place perhaps in all of America, maybe even the whole world, the rotunda of the United States Capitol. Right here is the gold dot in the center of the rotunda. And again, when I stand on this, my voice is amplified 5 or 10 times. I hear it in my head and it's reverberating all around this dome and inside my own dome. Remember, one story beneath us is the white star in the center of the crypt. One story beneath that is Washington's tomb. And here we are now on this gold dot, looking up at George Washington, the founding father of America, as an ascended being on the rainbow in front of the sun gate. The reason why Washington's tomb is empty is because he is risen. He is in the heavenly realms. He's gone through the stargate, the circle of stars, the 72 stars that surrounds the apotheosis of Washington, and is beckoning us to join him, actually inviting us to receive the blessing of America, of true freedom, of liberty that is bestowed upon us and is inherent in this place. Now, what I like to do is to lay on my back and just look up at George Washington in this magnificent building and allow the energy of this dome, of this stargate, to literally just fill my consciousness. George Washington is not alone when we look up there. He has goddesses around him. He has 13 star maidens that surround him. In addition to that, he's got 5 gods. The 5 gods of alchemy, of earth, air, fire, water, and space-time surround him. And what Constantino Brumidi, the painter who painted this magnificent painting, tells us is that the way that we become a risen being is to harness the power of those elements within us, to balance those elements, and then by doing so, we can literally achieve this transformative consciousness that's embodied here by George Washington. It's a stunning experience to sit here and just allow this place to seep into you and recognize how truly free we are and how fortunate we are to be able to live in a country that allows these freedoms. So I'm just going to sit here and concentrate and focus and meditate on the energy of this place and visualize myself, just like George Washington, rising through that gateway right up through the sun gate into the heavenly realms. In Dan Brown's book, The Lost Symbol, he introduces us to the concept of noetics, the idea that people can focus their energy or their intention on a specific spot to affect change. I believe that if 3 times a day Americans turned towards the U.S. Capitol dome and sent positive energy or intentions, that we could bring about dramatic change. This isn't hocus pocus. This is new science. This is actual solid fact about how we can affect change. And now, in this segment of Beyond the Veil, Claire is going to take us closer to the mysteries of the divine spark through the eyes of the great Renaissance master, Sandro Botticelli.
Did Constantino Brumidi, a former Vatican painter, encode the secrets of ascension in the dome of the US Capitol? Did he do so to settle an old score with the Vatican? In this segment of Beyond the Veil, we'll find out. Born in Rome on July the 26th, 1805, Constantino Brumidi began his study of art at the age of 13, when he was accepted at the acclaimed Accademia di San Luca. He spent the early years of his artistic life in the most powerful and prestigious center of artistic patronage in Rome. Throughout the 1840s, Brumidi painted extensively in Rome, moving from one prestigious Vatican project to another. Brumidi's classical training in Rome gave him a thorough understanding of ancient Roman, Renaissance and Baroque styles, symbols, and techniques of wall painting. He restored the works of Raphael, the greatest painter of the High Renaissance. Raphael's style was imprinted on Brumidi's imagination and would later play an important role in Brumidi's masterpiece. The 4 Raphael rooms in the Palace of the Vatican form a suite of reception rooms, the public part of the papal apartments. They are famous for their frescoes, painted by Raphael, and those in the workshop. Then destiny intervened. In 1848, Brumidi found himself on the wrong side of the revolution in Rome. He was falsely accused and found guilty by the Vatican court and sentenced to 18 years in prison. Seeing a new Raphael, the Jesuits intervened, a religious society formed in 1559 by the Spaniard Ignatius Loyola, who had a mystical vision of Christ. Some call the Jesuits the Pope's private militia and the most learned in matters of arcanum. The Jesuits made a deal with the Vatican that enabled Brumidi to come to the United States to paint churches in New York City. The Pope agreed, but only on the condition that Brumidi's wife and children remain in Rome. Brumidi stayed in New York for a short time. His destiny to paint his masterpiece in the dome of the US Capitol was calling. He aimed to outdo the great Raphael. When Brumidi arrived at the Capitol, he must have immediately seen a resemblance to his former workspace. His first job was to paint the Senate corridors. He did so in the style of Raphael's corridors in the Vatican. They became known as the Brumidi corridors. Brumidi's masterpiece is in the rotunda of the Capitol Temple. Its title is the Apotheosis of George Washington. It is arcanum, surrounded by 72 stars. Floating in the center of the apotheosis is a uniformed Washington, sits enthroned on a rainbow in front of a sun gate. Liberty is holding her fasces, which is a goddess symbol of transformation and a combination of victory and fame, sounding a trumpet that flanks him. Apotheosis is a Greek word that means to raise to God-like stature, or the glorification of a person as an ideal. Indeed, this fresco depicts Washington as a God-man, but not just any God-man. Christian art portrays Jesus sitting on a rainbow and enthroned exactly the same way. Did Brumidi intend to connect Washington with Christ? Perhaps so. He called Washington the savior of the nation. In his 2008 presentation, American Right, William Henry was the first to publish the historical discovery that Washington on the rainbow was equivalent to the resurrected Jesus on the rainbow. He also identified the US Capitol as a portal and a temple of ascension. William teamed up with Dr. Mark Gray, and in 2009 they published their book, Freedom's Gate, which was about the US Capitol. Later, in 2009, Dan Brown wrote of the Capitol as a portal, and the apotheosis in his book The Lost Symbol, confirming William's original historical discovery that the Capitol is a portal and the apotheosis holds a key to higher human consciousness. As a specialist in the Tibetan rainbow-bodied tradition, William readily observed that both Washington and Jesus are equivalent to the Tibetan masters who have achieved the rainbow body of light. Called the great perfection or mystic rapture, a teacher or yogi who has acquired the highest forms of accomplishment can transform the subtle aspects of the body into pure light, or what is called the rainbow body or body of light. It is not so much a body, but rather a vortex of energy into which these adepts can transform themselves on dying. This is what Enoch said happened to him. After his translation, Enoch's name was changed to Metatron. It became an angelic guide for humans in their ascension journeys. Did George Washington go through the Stargate like Enoch? Is this what the Masons were trying to convey in the apotheosis of Washington? Going beyond the veil, we will see that Metatron's cube is embedded in the apotheosis. Metatron is the heavenly name of Enoch. In order to reveal this, we must first explore some of the other participants in Washington's ascension. First, Washington is flanked by liberty and fame. He is guarded by Freedom, the goddess of America. She wears the crown of stars, the breastplate of righteousness, and other tools of the divine realm. Bromide's American wife was the model for freedom. Washington is surrounded by 13 star maidens. That's the number of star systems where the rainbow body is taught, say the Tibetans. Then there is Poseidon, the ruler of Atlantis, with the trident in his hand. Mercury, the Roman name for Hermes or Thoth, the god of Arcanum, he holds the caduceus. Next is Hephaestus, the god of smithcraft and alchemy. Then we have the earth goddess, Ceres, with young America. She holds the cornucopia, a symbol of abundance. Finally, we have Benjamin Franklin, sitting with Athena at the end of the rainbow. All 5 gods of the apotheosis, Mercury, god of wood, Ceres, goddess of agriculture and earth, Minerva, goddess of wisdom and metal, Neptune, god of water, and finally Vulcan, the god of fire, are pagan gods that died with the fall of Rome and the advent of the Catholic Church. All 5 have connections to traditional European alchemy and to the 5 elements of Chinese alchemy, which are wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. These are the 5 pagan gods the Vatican had spent 1,500 years trying to destroy. Why did Bromide resurrect them for his painting? As Henry and Gray reveal, these 5 gods symbolize the 5 elements of alchemy: earth, air, fire, water, and space-time. The pentacle, with its 5 lines and 5 angles, is the symbol of the 5 elements together. Revealed by Henry and Gray for the first time, the pentacle fits perfectly when superimposed over the gods of the alchemical elements in the apotheosis. Tibetans teach that the rainbow body is constituted by the 5 pure lights. They are often associated with the 5-coloured Himalayan rainbow: white, yellow, red, green, and blue. The 5 pure lights are understood as pure light energy and considered the most sublime essence quality of the classical elements named space, air, water, fire, and earth. Bromides' message is loud and clear. Through the discovery of arcanum and the alchemical process, we attain freedom and liberty. Now we are prepared to go one step deeper in the apotheosis. Pulling back the veil, we see that Metatron's cube fits perfectly within the layout of the apotheosis. 13 circles form Metatron's cube. It is a hexagram inside a hexagon, or a cube within a cube. The diagram created by connecting the centers of all the circles in the form, 2 rings of 6 and 1 in the center, is said to function as a blueprint for the crystal structures of all carbon-based life. Metatron's cube was discovered by the brilliant 13th century Italian mathematician and discoverer of the golden mean ratio, Leonardo Pisano, better known as Fibonacci. It represents magic, alchemy, and ascension. Out of the box is exactly where meditating on Metatron's cube takes us. It opens the way to higher dimensional thinking or multidimensional consciousness. It takes us out of the wilderness of earth life into the heavenly realms, to the realm of the free souls. If Metatron's cube does indeed symbolize the philosopher's stone, it is the lost symbol and the lost keystone of the Temple of Liberty, the US Capitol. This would explain why the Metatron's cube geometry fits so eloquently on apotheosis of George Washington, who it now appears has become not just metahuman, but Metatron. This is why Henry and Gray call the apotheosis the greatest alchemical icon of all time. Did Constantino Bromidi plan to create it, or did it just happen? Before his death in 1871, one of Bromidi's daughters, who was finally allowed to leave Italy, visited her father and saw his masterpiece of Arcanum. It must have been a very moving moment. Even Raphael would have been proud.
I'm William Henry. Thank you for watching Arcanum.
And I'm Claire Henry. See you next time.